The Legacy of Cthulhu is a rules-light tabletop RPG by J.M. Pimentel and Bruno Sattler, published in 2023 after a successful Kickstarter. This game pretty much has three things going for it and will appeal to people who are into these three things. The first is that it is based on Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. So think Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green and all that, but unlike those games, and this is the second major feature of this game, the rules are very simple and straightforward. And thirdly, because of that simple rule set, it's ideal for solo play, which this 152-page rulebook accommodates with the tables needed to generate scenarios and encounters. The premise of the Legacy of Cthulhu is that Cthulhu itself did in fact rise from the ocean and fulfill the prophecies told by the crazed cultists in the original story. This led to the rise or arrival of a number of other great old ones who, if you're not familiar, are a motley crew of demigods who don't really care about humans at all, but like to hang around Earth and mess with us and make our planet a living hell. Well, in this game, they get what they wanted. Civilization has been destroyed across the world, and you start the game about a year into this Lovecraftian apocalypse, which is to say, this is a mid-apocalypse survival RPG, and you're fighting against Lovecraftian foes large and small, as well as other survivors. As I mentioned, this game is pretty rules light. You have three core stats: body, presence, and mind. They start with 4, 3, and 2 in whichever allocation you want. Then you derive 3 point pools from those: your hit points, stance, and willpower. Hit points represent your physical health, stance is like your social power, and willpower is more or less your sanity. It's a little confusing on the character sheet how the core stats and the secondary stats and the other things you have to track, like food, medicine, and sanity, are all given the same little circle icon. This is one of those cases where I could probably design a more intuitive character sheet, but I'm hoping somebody online has already done that for me. As far as depleting your hit points, when you hit 0 and there's no one around to help you, you simply die. The game doesn't really explain it, but I assume that if there is another person around to help you, they can use a turn to stabilize you with 1 HP, and you can recover 1 or 2 HP per day of rest, which is to say, the game is pretty brutal and you're encouraged to run away from fights whenever possible. Stance points are a quick way of gauging your ability to influence and command other characters. If you have more stance points than them, then you have a natural dominance over them socially. You can make a presence check to actually reduce another character's stance point pool as well. Willpower is your sanity pool, and if it gets reduced to 0, you risk picking up insanity markers and eventually losing your character altogether. You can burn willpower to re-roll dice, but more often than not, you're losing it when you see horrible things like certain monsters and any great ones, as well as when casting any spell. You start with 3 skills. You can see here that you have a list of 13 on the character sheet and space to write more skills if you think of some that aren't here. These are not tied to any stat and can in fact be associated with any of the 3 stats depending on how you describe your character using the skill. If you have a skill that is associated with a check, you add 2 to the dice roll for that check. If you don't have a related skill, then you just add the value of the core stat that's being used. As far as starting gear, you get a weapon, piece of equipment, 2 random items, some food, and some medicine. Weapons and equipment are what I would consider in this game to be bog standard modern era fare. The exotic weapons could be a lot of fun as well, and honestly, if I were running this game, I'd be fairly generous about providing these kinds of weapons to PCs. The dice mechanic in this game is very straightforward. You roll a single D10 to determine virtually everything. It's D10 plus the associated stat, plus 2 more if you have an associated skill, the sum of which needs to meet or beat a 10. Any points above 10 will result in bonus effects such as extra damage, more stance reduced on a target, or bonuses applied to future rolls. Environmental and situational factors result in advantage and disadvantage, where you roll 2d10s and take the better or worse of the 2 rolls. Ranges are the simplest I've seen. You're either in melee range, ranged attack range, or you're out of range. You probably don't need a grid to play this game. There are essentially 3 ways to die in this game. You either run out of HP from physical harm, or you run out of food, which happens when you don't eat for a certain number of days based on your body stat, or you pick up too many insanity markers, the maximum of which is based on your mind stat. If you fill that up, you go insane and die moments later. Unlike the looming death resulting from hitting 0 HP, this type of death seems to be more immediate. In the spirit of Lovecraft, casting spells is taxing and dangerous. There are no character classes in this game, and all characters are able to cast. They start with the number of spells equal to their mind stat, so that is either 2, 3, or 4 at the onset. You have to pass a mind plus arcana check to succeed a cast, but you still suffer any drawbacks of a given spell even if you fail this check. All these spells cost willpower points, and sometimes you have to mark insanity. One notable thing here is that there are no levels or gateways to getting any of these more powerful spells. If you pick up the spell at character creation or after spending XP, then you simply have the spell. And if you pay the cost and you roll well, then you cast it, which is an interesting design approach and one that can really make one-shots and shorter campaigns interesting because players aren't having to spend multiple sessions to unlock more powerful spells. A lot of these spells are pretty potent, like Create Undead, which allows a player to reanimate an obedient corpse. Notice that there is no limit on the number of corpses that can be raised, and they pretty much stay faithful until they are destroyed. As a proud min-maxer and ruiner of games, I find spells like this jump out at me. There are actually a lot of control spells, by the way, where you command one kind of creature or another. And just for the record, there is a resurrection spell where you can bring back a person that has been dead for a year or less, which is pretty generous. Spells are just generally a lot of fun, but the magical artifacts are where you can really cause a ruckus, because for some of these, there is no cost to using them. Some of them do have a pretty steep cost though, such as the Black Mirror, which will give you a faraway vision or answer a question, but give you 2 insanity markers if you fail the check to activate it. Shelters are a really important aspect of the game that I think elevates it beyond just poking around in an urban wasteland. And this aspect is especially important if you're playing solo and want to really flesh out a story in a journal or something. All parties start with a shelter, and that can take the form of a residence, an underground chamber, really anything that fits into one of these archetypes down here. Mechanically, what's important is the shelter's defense rating, which is literally the shelter's hit points in the event of an attack, amount of space that it starts with, and technology rating, which tells you how many upgrades you can make to it. There are 17 shelter upgrades described in the book, and they're all pretty relevant to post-apocalypse survival. One of the most potent out of this list is the workshop, which is required for creating and upgrading certain powerful items. Did I mention that I have some min-max tendencies? The play cycle is actually pretty tightly defined, which I found to be a nice feature since it means that if you're playing this co-op or solo, you're not stuck figuring out what to do next. There's an actual process here. You start the game on day 1 at 6 a.m. in your shelter. That shelter is located on a tile. In order to get the ball rolling, you will travel in one of 6 directions into another tile. This takes 1 hour in game time on foot, or half an hour on a vehicle. And before you geek out in the comments about how some vehicles are faster than others, just sit back and bask in the beauty of rules-light gaming. If you really want to complicate vehicle travel times, you can make a short table that lists travel times for different modes of transportation. Or you can just rationalize the half hour for every kind of vehicle because bad roads and rough terrain, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, step 1 takes place in this new tile that you've reached, and you choose an action. That could be acquiring an item, building or upgrading an item, finding a survivor, hunting for food, or looking for a new shelter, whatever. Then you roll for an event that is associated with that tile's terrain type. Then if you want to stay there, you roll a d10 to see if there will be a violent encounter. You can then move on to another tile if you like. One crazy thing is that every single night, there is a 10% chance of an attack from a horde of creatures. The game has 6 core types of terrain, each with their own table for events. You can either draw these tiles randomly when exploring or map them out in advance. There's a section at the end of the book that has a bunch of example areas where the tiles are all pre-selected for a quick game. Here's an example of an event table, in this case for underground tiles. You roll 2d10 to get a result. Events range from violent encounters to finding a bunch of survivors, to finding a new shelter, or even triggering a so-called important event. There are also special scenarios that can be triggered, as shown by these 5 tiles. These have unique 2d10 event tables associated with them as well. Shopping Mall is always going to be my favorite. I know that this is not exclusively a zombie game, even though there are undead, but I've always craved a game that would faithfully recreate 1978's Dawn of the Dead or Capcom's classic Dead Rising. One thing to note about the Violent Encounters table is that you have about the same chance of encountering a ghost or group of ghouls as you do a boss level Dagon or 6 to 15 snake men. There's absolutely no mediation of difficulty, which makes the daily hex crawl fraught with danger. And again, you're encouraged to run away from fights if you can. The nightly horde attack check is even crazier since it's basically bound to happen. On a 9 or 0 on this horde attack table, you trigger a great old one. I almost can't see PCs getting out alive from an encounter with one of these. Probably the most important thing to note about playing solo is this oracle table right here. If and when you have a question about a situation, you ask a binary question and let the D10 answer for you. You can also use the D10 to determine numbers, degrees, or percentages as an answer to your question. In the case of so-called important events, there are 4 tables that you roll on to randomly generate them. These events act as mini quests, and per the rules, you're not allowed to continue with the play cycle until you've resolved this kind of event. But again, running away is always an option. One other thing to note is the generous initiative scheme that is granted to players in co-op mode. Check this out. Quote, all characters will perform their actions first, choosing their targets, and then, quote, after the actions from the players, it is time for the surviving enemies to react. If they perform an attack, they will direct it towards a targeted character chosen by the players. Very nice. You get 1 XP for each day that your character survives, plus XP that might come from important events. You spend those XP according to this table here. New spells can be pretty cool, but remember, you need to have a deep pool of willpower points to cast with any frequency. Here's a 2-page example of how the game cycle plays out. Notice the campaign goals. There isn't a lot of guidance in the book on how to create these, but this is just a great thing to establish if you're playing this game, since you don't want to just find yourself aimlessly hex crawling with no other purpose than to survive. One nice touch was the decent number of pre-generated scenarios that come in the form of cities, like Arkham, for example, which has a short description, a cast of important NPCs with stat blocks, and a map with well enough described locations. Check out Miskatonic University statted out as a shelter here. This is a pretty enticing place for characters to set up shop. It's completely loaded with upgrades, or do you have to unlock these upgrades yourself? I'm not sure. Arkham is actually the one major pre-made scenario with all the bells and whistles. The rest of them are shorter, like this 2-page treatment of Dunwich. There are some real cities included as well, like Berlin, which has a special environmental rule of supernaturally cold weather, as well as some special enemies. The chapter on enemies is quite serviceable for a Cthulhu mythos-themed RPG. You're going to get all the basics like cultists and a variety of crazed humans, ghouls, ghosts, all that. I think I might be a bit spoiled after reading the Malleus Monstrorum, but I don't think it would take too much effort to down-convert a Call of Cthulhu stat block to a Legacy of Cthulhu one. Look at the beautiful simplicity of these stat and ability descriptions. Again, I think it's crazy how high your chance of running into a great old one is in this game. Note that Hastur is correctly described as unkillable. There's a bonus supplement included in the digital version of this game called Before the End, and it basically repackages the game as a pre-apocalypse RPG, which is to say, if you wanted to play something a lot closer to vanilla Call of Cthulhu in terms of the setting, you can use this toolbox of mechanical tweaks to do that. One of the big differences is the tiles. You'll notice that each of the area archetypes included here are geared towards a still functional urban civilization. And of course, they all come with their unique event tables. There are also rules for creating expedition mini quests that can take your characters really anywhere. And the oracle tables are different to reflect the more living urban nature of the setting. One other thing I wanted to note was this companion game that came with the Legacy of Cthulhu for Kickstarter backers called The Vampire Alone in the Darkness by the same creators. I'm not going to go through the whole game here, but I wanted to point out that this game is based on the exact same mechanics as Legacy, but actually has a handful of different sub-mechanics to mesh with the theme of your character being a vampire. It's not just a shameless reskin. Much like the way Legacy of Cthulhu could be construed as a light, casual version of Call of Cthulhu, this game, The Vampire Alone in the Darkness, could be thought of as a Vampire the Masquerade light, where you can engage with World of Darkness flavored lore and gameplay, but not really have to commit yourself or your table to hundreds of pages of reading. You have these different monstrous clans, for example, that are analogous to the Vampire the Masquerade stuff, but look, they each fit on one page. Actually, speaking of World of Darkness, I really do think that's what the creators are going for here. At the time of recording, they are working on 2 more games that I think are using the same fundamentally light and approachable D10 system, one called Lycanthrope and one called Witch. I'm interested to see what kind of small changes or additions they make to the rules of each game to integrate them more closely with the themes. Alright, so here are my thoughts on the Legacy of Cthulhu. Deadly imbalance. I do like the fact that anytime you leave your shelter and go on an excursion, it is extremely perilous, but the fact that you have to make a horde attack check every night, and that check has a 20% chance of triggering an encounter with an unbeatable boss level great one, like Cthulhu itself, is just extreme. This is a pretty simple fix though. You can just modify that one table to not include great ones, and simply start a clock that gets ticked away when certain events in the fiction occur. And then at the end of that clock, you can either roll to have a great one appear or just have it appear. Character sheet. I would have liked to see more differentiation between the core stats, secondary stats, and resource pools here. This is a bit homogeneous. Simple and accessible. Some people really don't like rules light RPGs, and I get that. They derive their pleasure from explicit rules formulations and de jure declarations on every edge case for everything. And actually, if I were playing a single RPG for months or years on end with a dedicated group, I'd probably also want something mechanically deep in that case. But in most cases, I don't get to enjoy long campaigns and dedicated erudite players. So a game like this is extremely appealing to me. The rules are so simple that you can get a group playing in minutes, and that means quickly getting to enjoying the theme and the thrills of the game itself. All the spells. I like that there are no classes and that any character can just jump in and grab whatever crazy spell they want. Just as there are no limiters that hold back the great one from stomping up onto your shelter at the end of day 1, there's nothing stopping your brand new PC from starting an army of undead. Shelters. I love headquarters in RPGs. They can act as a shared PC in some ways, getting leveled up and taking on a story of their own, and transcending the lifespan of individual PCs, unless Cthulhu just pops in and destroys it. The Mind's Vision ecosystem. Mind's Vision is the name of the company through which J.M. Pimentel and Bruno Sattler have published this game and the vampire one, by the way. I'm excited to see their Lycanthrope and Witch games, which again I presume will use the same basic mechanics. The whole lineup of games is turning out to be like a petite portable version of the World of Darkness games. The underlying rules very comfortably give you the option of playing co-op or solo as well, which is just a nice feature to have. So that's all I've got on the Legacy of Cthulhu. Let me know down in the comments if you backed this one on Kickstarter or if you've gotten it to your table. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and on The Vampire Alone in the Darkness if you've played that one. Links to where you can get these games are below. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.